So I'd like to thank everybody to coming to the afternoon panel. I hope lunch was great. My name is Rob Thompson. I'm the moderator for, as I said, the innovation panel. I'm very excited to moderate this panel. We have an excellent selection of people, both with civilian and military background, academia, and national research labs as well. And what really excites me about the innovation panel in particular is that we're not just looking at the state of cyber and cybersecurity and cyber defense today, but we're also looking at what's going to be coming down the pipeline 5 and 10 years out. And so when thinking about questions, don't just think about what we're talking about now, but think about how this is going to be applied over the next few years. I'd like to start briefly and just introduce our first speaker. Bruce Pelkins is a research professor at the University of Central Florida, the Institute of Simulation and Training, and he's also a retired colonel. So I'm looking forward to hearing his first perspectives and leading us off.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Bruce Pelkins. I wanted to give a quick introduction. My background, when I was in the Army, spent 28 years. A lot of it was in signal and the precursors for the 17 branch that were 53s and others that were setting the stage. My background was more on the technology side, and ironically, when I started working at UCF last year, or actually beginning of this year, it was the behavioral side that really came to the forefront because, well, as we all know, there's a lot of both training in the military, but also in academia, of what are the right education and training aspects within cyber. You know, a lot of focus on the tools and how to defend properly, how to attack, and programming and different capabilities. And so, what I wanted to do is take a little different twist, even though my background is computer science. Fortunately, my co-authors on this paper, they're all psychologists, human factors related, which is really good because at the institute we work at, it's very heavy in modeling, simulation, and basically human-in-the-loop. Why is this important for what motivates hackers to do certain things, how do we model that, and so on. So what we started with this framework, we looked at several things that were already out there. We looked at the cyber workforce framework, that has been out there with 7 categories. This is the abstract of the paper. And we really wanted to see, can we map the NICS information to this framework and find some gaps or elicit some information that really can tell us in academia, what are the holes? What are we teaching? What are we not teaching perhaps to that? And are there some soft skills versus the hard skills that we can get at as well? So we looked at these categories, there's 7 of them that are out there, and what we found is really 2, perhaps even 3 of the categories, at least in academia, really need to be explored a little bit further. So I'm kind of giving you the end of the story here, but that's okay. So we looked, it's kind of hard to see, but we looked at 7 categories, each one of the boxes, and we took the different subcategories within NICS and say, okay, we're going to map this. Now, for example, computer networks I have under the operate maintain. But when we did our research and did a lot of the analysis between schools, that particular computer networks category can be mapped to other categories within the cyberspace workforce framework. So, but we tried to have a one-to-one mapping, so we could elicit the gaps, because some of these, again, can be mapped to others, to several of these categories. And what we found is, is that these 3 really stood out. There's good reasons for it too, because when you talk about collecting and a very Intel type thing, there are some, but there's not quite a lot out there within the academic realm. Now, this is an initial foray into this, so if you have arguments or disagreements, we would love to hear from you, because we're trying to continue this and to really say, what is the right answer? Because when you do these gap analysis, you really want to figure out where should we be teaching, and also hopefully inform, because we're working with Army Cyber Center of Excellence, to help them figure out where do they need to go from here within their training as well. Because they do, the military does teach more on, investigations, collect and operate within the cyber realm and analysis, of course. So we found these gaps, and these are more explained here. And we wanted to say, should we teach this, or how do we determine what the KSAs are they hard skills or soft skills? So that's kind of the connecting tissue for all this. So we looked at the soft skills emphasis that we needed in this area, and we looked at, can we have more human-centric, really human-centric based training and education within academia? Can we get psychologists together, and can we get other aspects within law enforcement and other things to really figure out what motivates the hackers? How do we model the hacker-defender transactions? Is it even possible? So these are the initial research that we're looking at right now. So we set up, and this is actually for another conference that we're going to present in December in Orlando. It's called the ITSEC conference. We set up a Qualtrics survey online, and we elicited people to participate, and we got 117 responses, a lot of them from the 53 listserver. And 117 doesn't sound like a lot for responses, but for the people that I work with, that's like Woodstock. So because they said, well, if you get over 30, you'll be lucky. So I went to the listserver, and as they always do, they came through. It's a list, for those who don't know, it's a listserver geared towards Army automation and now cyber as well. And there's about 2,000 people that are subscribers to it. Old technology, but it's really good stuff. So we had 5 case studies, and we looked at, within the survey, we wanted their responses. We said it was okay, and these were actual 5 events that happened that were out in the public domain. We said, look at each survey, or look at each case study, and tell us, is this more human-centric or technocentric? And we chose these KSAs there. Now, I have firewalls as a KSA, but that's not, the actual title of it. But just, is this more, is installing and operating a firewall, was that what was deficient here? Is that why they were able to get attacked? Or is there encryption issues and so forth? And on the human-centric side, we wanted to see if there was anything there with social behaviors, human performance. And surprisingly, what happened was the soft techniques, the soft skills, if you will, came out a lot in those 5 case studies as far as what the respondents said. And most of the respondents, I would submit, are very technical in nature. Because that's, the 53 listserver is pretty technical form. So I was very pleased that they did see the human element in it and the importance of what those KSAs really meant to the study itself. And so the overarching conclusion is there is a need for human-centric training in addition to techno-centric training. So, as I said, my background is computer science. I never would say we need less education and training within the techniques and the tools in cyber, but I still submit that there's quite a bit that needs to be done on the human side. Those are blowing up a little bit more for you. So we took these things, and I'll go through this really quick, but these are in your in the slides, so you can take them later. What we did at UCF last year is to start behavioral grad certificate track, and we looked at the background that UCF has, and try to figure out how do we expand that into the behavioral side. So we looked at 3 areas: human factors, cyber, and modeling and simulation, and try to combine it together in one graduate certificate, hopefully to expand it to other things. But we're trying to work with other institutions as well. We know that University of Maryland has a similar program. Howard University does as well. So we're hoping that more universities will do their part and maybe get at the analysis piece more, because ours doesn't get at the analysis piece as much. And as I showed before, that we think we consider that probably one of the primary gaps in there. And we're trying to expand that, not necessarily at UCF, but also within the country itself. And it would make sense a lot, frankly, if it was in the DC area. These are different courses. Go quickly through that. Time. And we mapped it, and finally we mapped it to our courses. So each one of the 5 courses that we have in the grad certificate, we used the 10 KSAs on the bottom and mapped it to each one. So as you can see, we're still trying to figure out, are these the right answers, and how do we get at it, and how do we expand the program more? Just explain more. That's just for your benefit. That's my talk. Are there any questions?
Hi, Bill Taylor with U.S. Army Survey. My question is this a master's certificate program, or is this a master's degree curriculum?
Well, a little both, actually, because at UCF there is a modeling simulation PhD and master's program, and these can be used as electives. But for the people, and so you don't have to take all of them, you just take one at a time, and they're all face-to-face. There's an option to take it face-to-face or 100% online. But if you take all 5 in the program, get enrolled into the grad certificate program, you're going to get a certificate. There's not yet a master's program yet. That's just cyber-related, behavioral cyber-related. Thanks.
Lee Armstead from Paragon Technical Solutions. I've been working a lot with the community college down in Hampton Roads, about 3 hours south of here. And a lot of times when you talk about workforce, you're talking perhaps at the community college level, or you're talking about some sort of trade. So how do you take your program you're developing here? Is there going to be the ability for maybe a non-certificate or a non-degree, maybe a lower level? Does that make sense? Because a lot of times when you talk about workforce, like I hire people to do work for DoD or federal. A lot of times you don't need a master's degree.
Right.
You need certificates. So going forward, how are you looking to maybe expand that to maybe different levels?
Being brand new, we haven't really looked at that portion, because UCF does have quite a robust undergrad program in cyber. One of the slides that I went pretty quick over, they won the NCAA's last 3 years, so they have a huge pool of people that teach at the undergrad, but not in the behavioral side. That's something we could probably look into. I think that's a good way to expand it, because then you can get them interested and maybe go into the graduate level later. So that's a great comment.
I'd actually like to ask a question.
No.
No.
Request denied.
Request denied. Thank you. I quite enjoyed your talk. I was wondering, with this strong focus that is being placed on human-centric training, what do you see the role of more hands-on research in terms of apprenticeships being integrated into the curriculum? Because it seems to me, at least, that with this focus on human-centric behavior, that's going to be as harder to capture in a classroom dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility down the road. Again, we haven't, I'm saying this is the last question, we haven't really looked at something like that. But I think if we could figure out, does this, go back to the gap analysis, does this hit some gap that we're doing, and maybe, that might actually be more for that type of undergrad program, as I'm thinking aloud. But I think if that certainly fits one of the gaps, we'll have to explore it, because this is kind of one untapped areas. I really believe that different schools are going to have to really consider and try and find a way to support it one way or another. At least within the Florida school system, grad certificates are a lot easier to start up than a master's or PhD. I'm sure it's the same in others. So I think that's a really good point.
Jim Chen from National Defense University. I'm just curious whether you look into ethics in the program for the KSAs.
What do we need ethics for? No. Yes, we are. I mean, actually, for one of the classes that we have, it's called Cyber Issues, and we bring in speakers. One of the speakers we brought in was from the National Security Council, their cyber policy guru, who was a friend of mine. But I also brought in a digital ethics professor from on campus, because that is something that it's not just about the tools, the techniques, procedures within cyber. You got to realize there's certain things we can and can't do, and this is why. And he gave, he's I think he's a philosophy instructor or professor. He gave a great class because it was so different than anything else they had. They really ate it up. So what I did was for this, we do these classes as a cohort. It starts in the fall and it ends in the following fall. So I did it in the summer, but then I brought him, for the second cohort, I brought him to teach as a guest lecturer this fall for the second cohort, and again, the second time around, they just loved it, just because he brings out issues that you don't think about, and then it may give you more of a left and right limit, as we'd say in the Army, to realize, okay, I really can't do that, and this is why, or I really shouldn't do that. And so that's a great point, but that's something that should be almost in every curriculum, along with cyber legal issues too. That goes hand in hand with that. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Josiah Dykstra. He's a senior researcher at the Laboratory for Telecommunication Sciences. Quite interesting that he's got a very nice broad background. He's done research into digital forensics, network security, and interesting and close to my heart, also augmented reality. So without further ado.
Good afternoon. My name is Josiah Dykstra. I am a computer scientist and a cybersecurity researcher. The presentation I'm going to talk to you about today is about managing risk in cybersecurity situations using something called the Kinevin Framework. How many of you remember the Apple slogan, think different? So Kinevin is about how to think, not only how to think, but also how to act differently. And it says that situations that you're in are all kind of unique and that one size doesn't fit all. And I want to explain this approach using a hypothetical story. So imagine, if you will, that you're the head of an organization, a head of a company, and you've been called to the Security Operations Center. Now, a SOC is sort of a 24/7 cybersecurity hub. This is where technical people monitor what's going on in the enterprise, and where they sort of coordinate defense of the information systems. So you walk into this sort of high-tech facility. Many of them actually look just like this, but it feels different to you. Maybe people are running around, and the alarms are going off, and the lights are flashing. Maybe movie-like in your sort of perspective, but you think something doesn't sort of feel right. Like things feel chaotic here. And what I want to point out is that by the end of the presentation, I want you to see that this situation is different for reasons that you might think. So what we're going to talk about is how Kinevin is not just for leaders, but really it's for everybody in the organization. It's how all people can use a framework to manage risk. So before we get back to the SOC, let's talk about Kinevin. Kinevin is a Welsh word, and it means a place of multiple belongings. And it was developed quite some time ago, not for cybersecurity, but as a sort of general framework by a researcher named Dave Snowden. What we have tried to do is apply this approach to cybersecurity. And it's been applied to many different domains. What I want to talk about is how to apply it to our domain today. So it's important to note that Kinevin is not a categorization model. It's not a 2x2 matrix where you just take data and dump it into the framework. But Kinevin is what we call a sense-making model. And it helps us sort of understand what is the situation that we're in. And how can we take different thinking and different approaches sort of based on what is happening. So Kinevin is comprised of 5 what they call domains. And in the middle, the one sort of unlabeled, the little blob, is called disorder. So disorder is the domain sort of when you don't know which other domain is predominant. Lots of situations sort of start in that order of disorder. The other 4 are combined into 2 broad categories. On the right-hand side, we have sort of ordered, and on the left, we have unordered sort of situations. So if you have a situation that falls in the obvious environment, the sort of bottom right here, what you want to do there is what we would generally call best practice. And the reason that you can do best practice is that cause and effect are very well correlated. It's easy to see this thing is making this thing happen. We can go to standard cybersecurity practices and we can say, the best practice in this situation is blah, and we do blah. On the other hand, if we have the complicated environment in the upper right, what what you want to do is sort of act based on expertise and analysis. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but there might be several options to consider. In the best practice case, there was really one thing that you should do. In the complicated environment, there is good practice. And so we first sense, we analyze, and we sort of respond lastly. In the upper left, we have the complex domain. This one is where you do exploration, where you do experimentation, because cause and effect isn't obvious in the situation, even though it might be in hindsight. So we start by probing and sensing before we respond. And we would call that emergent practice. The final one is the chaotic environment. This is not a great one to be in. In this environment, you need to act first. It's not clear what the cause and effect are, and they're probably shifting all the time. Those are environments, we'll talk about a situation where that might be true in cyber in a second. So depending on which environment you're in, you think differently, you act differently. The trouble is that most people want to do sort of what is comfortable. People who are very controlling will walk into an environment and want to take control, to jump to conclusions and sort of always act first. But it depends on the kind of situation, I would say, whether that is appropriate or not. So, let's say that that hypothetical organization that you were the head of is a hospital, a nonprofit hospital, a big hospital. Let's say you have 1,000 beds and you have 10,000 computers, and you're a major sort of crisis center for the area. And the first thing you probably want to do as you walk into that command center is to take control, right? This is a very important community asset. People's lives are at stake. It's easy to say, we know what we should do in that situation. But instead, Kinevin says that we should think about that situation as a disordered environment. When you just walk into a room and you see crisis, you actually don't know how much you know about what's going on. And so the default, like we said, is in the middle in disorder. So there's usually somebody in charge of the SOC, right, and the watch officer, we might call them. And they come up to you and they say, look, I think what's going on here is we've been attacked by a guy who tried to log into our servers last week. And what the watch officer is doing is speculating. He's sort of jumping to that comfortable practice about trying to explain what's going on. Very human nature kind of thing, but I would say not necessarily the best course of action in that case. But let's pretend that there really were sort of failed logins to an internet-facing server, right? That happens all the time. And what we want to sort of realize about that is that that's a very common cybersecurity situation. There is actually best practice about what to do when somebody's sort of brute force logging into your system. So we put ourselves in the obvious domain, right? There is best practice. As long as you sort of see what's going on, yeah, we're sort of being logged into brute force, you can block that attack. There is best practice to know what to do. So let's say there's another layer of complexity in the SOC, in the situation that you're in. And the watch officer says, well, we see information leaking out of the hospital. Data's being exfiltrated, we don't know what's happening, we don't know how this started, and starts to sort of recall stories to you. And let's say in the situation that 2 weeks ago, somebody called the security center and said, we have a major server, we have a domain control in our network, it looks like there's files there we don't understand. And in terms of this domain, in a complicated domain, what you want to do is go to expertise. You go to a forensic specialist. You go to a malware reverse engineer. And you say, go figure out what's going on, right? Use your expertise to help understand the situation. Figure out that malware maybe got there through phishing, or the malware is harvesting credentials and it's sending all the data out of your network. But it's only the expert who can really do that. And that's why that domain sort of applies in that situation. So let's go back to the operations center again. And what if it really was suspicious email? What if there was a sort of phishing campaign that had gone on? Again, I think what you would want to do is engage a sort of security expert, right? Instead of sort of jumping to conclusions, phishing is a pretty well understood problem. It affects a lot of people, right? Lots of people open phishing for a variety of reasons, right? That is a very successful technique for attackers. But often it becomes obvious sort of in hindsight. It's hard to know immediately what is going on. A phishing campaign against your organization is hard to see sometimes in real time. But if this hospital had undergone, say, Sony Pictures-like attack. That connection between those two things would only sort of be relevant in hindsight. But yeah, maybe the employees of the hospital got sent an email and said, please log in to change your Apple ID, and they go to a fake form and they fall for this phishing attack. That could very well be what sort of happened in this case. Somebody was a victim, some victim, their laptop got exploited, and that's what allowed the sort of hacker to get into the network and start to steal information. So what we end up with in the complicated domain is good practice. It's not best practice. There's no one way to do things. But after you sort of investigate, this is a situation where investigation sort of comes first. We do the sensing, we do the analysis. We don't jump to responding right away. So the last one is the complex domain. And we have a lot of complexity in cybersecurity. You might think that this is the easy one just to jump to. But I would say that's not always the case. There's lots of unknowns in the situation that we describe in the SOC. There's lots of unknowns in everyday cybersecurity decisions, and it's not always clear what the best thing to do is. And so novel practice often presents itself. I would say novel practice here is not the same as innovation per se. It's we need to stop the hemorrhaging of data leaving the network. We need to act right away because very bad things are happening. Now, in the hospital, you might actually choose to say, we're going to pull the connection to the internet, right? We have to sort of stop the attack and weigh that against, well, what happens when we can't bill, and what happens if the surgeon needs access to the internet, or whatever the sort of case might be. But in this case, acting first actually is the way that you want to go. And we somehow missed complexity. This was my phishing analogy, where the cause and effect of things aren't necessarily tied together. Right? Phishing is one way to get into a network. There's other ways to get into networks. Right? Attackers have many tools in the toolkit. And so you sort of learn by poking down little rabbit holes. You try things out. Was it this? Was it this? Experts in the field, I think, are pretty good at this. Their experience helps them build on what's going on. I wouldn't always jump to phishing as a way that an attacker got into a network. And so I sort of learned how to do that. Chaotic is the one that I accidentally jumped to a second ago, which was this sort of acting first. Cutting somebody off from the internet, not always the right choice. The DoD might say, no matter what, we will never disconnect from the internet. Other countries have made a different choice. We will disconnect for political reasons, for security reasons, or other ones. Is that the right choice in this situation? I think it depends. And it is definitely a way to get a handle on the situation about what's going on. But jumping to action, I think, should be a very careful and deliberate choice. And you wouldn't always want to do that. That's a very novel practice. That probably isn't in the playbook. So there's a very good question about how do we transition between domains. Kinevin isn't meant to sort of be a circle like the OODA loop. It's not meant to sort of go around the circle. And it doesn't make any judgment calls to say, well, we always want to be in the obvious domain. Life isn't like that. That domain is no better or worse sort of inherently than complex or complicated. Just knowing that you have to act differently based on the complexity of the situation, that's what's important. But it is interesting to note sort of how you move from one domain to another. And in particular, the squiggly line at the bottom of this diagram, Snowden put there because it's easy to go from obvious and sort of fall off the cliff into chaotic. If you get very comfortable with what you're doing and you sort of get in the routine of doing things, it's very easy for some new situation to come along and you're only used to doing things in one particular way, and you sort of fall off this cliff, and you don't know how to react in any new situation. You become very complacent, and that's not a good place to be either. So what I want to point out is that there's times and a place, I think, to use Kinevin. It's a framework that I was not familiar with, and one that I thought really sort of spoke to the complexity of cybersecurity. I think all people in an organization can all apply this. It's not just for the senior leadership of an organization. And the people of your security operations center can make sort of localized decisions more effectively and more more appropriate for what's going on than if we always just act into, well, the way we've always done it is this. That's what I sort of worry about. I think it also sort of redefines secrecy, where we tend to sort of hide information to protect it, but especially in areas where more information would help lower the risk of a decision. Compartmentalizing data and sort of hiding information from people who need to know it increase the risk, and that isn't the situation that I would want to be in. I think it also increases collaboration. The fact that a team can come together and know that, well, we need subject matter experts who can sort of help us through a particular question where we don't have enough information. That kind of collaboration, you hear a lot about the benefits of collaboration, but I think Kinevin offers a different way sort of to think about that value. Just another reason for that. And with that, I would like to take some questions. Come right behind you.
Matthew Weinberg, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. One quick question that I think maybe you can kind of elaborate on a little bit more is the role of precedence and past experience in the model and where that factors into those quadrants or in disorder.
Yeah, precedence is an interesting one. I don't know that Dave Snowden explicitly sort of talked about that. I imagine he would put it in the sort of bottom right, where you sort of have experience to draw on, you know what happened last time. I think the difference with precedence is that it doesn't dictate what you do the next time. It's sort of a learning process, right? So last time we know what worked, and we know what we did, and either it worked or it didn't work. And we can make a more educated decision the next time. I don't know that it neatly falls into one of those domains, but I do think that it lowers complexity of the decision making. And for that reason, I would tend to put it in the sort of best practice domain, or somewhere near that. That would be my interpretation. Yes?
Hi, I'm with the University of Maryland. I think for the first half of your talk, I was thinking that what you were showing was a framework for understanding the situation, for diagnosing what the situation is. And I think as you went along, it became clear that you were talking about choosing a response to whatever the situation may be. Could you say a little bit about whether this could be an individual difference factor, that different individual people might default to one quadrant or another as their typical response to any situation? How can you measure that kind of thing, and so forth?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. In my opinion, it is very individualistic. I'm going to bring different experience and different expertise to deciding what to do in a situation than anybody else will. And I think that's fine. There's probably some corporate knowledge. The corporation might have a way of, or a village or organization or a company might have a way of doing that. And I think that's good. I think we wouldn't all want to sort of be able to jump to the same conclusions. And I think the sort of localized decision-making works fine in this situation. I guess I hadn't thought about it enough to decide if there could be a collision. If your understanding of the situation collides with mine, how do we sort of reconcile that? I can see how that could in theory be a problem. I haven't quite worked out in my head. I haven't thought enough about that. But that would be a sort of interesting thing to think about, whether we need universal sort of view of the world. Certainly, I see this in organizations all the time, where the senior leader has a very different view of what's going on than even like a technical expert working in the field. One might see it as more concerning than another. Certainly, there's more expertise between the two of them. And it's not to say that the senior leader is the bad one here. They might have contextual information that the workforce doesn't have. And so they might, in their mind, they might contextualize it as being less of an issue than what it really looks like. It might look like a fire to most people, but not to that person. If you ask how to measure that, I can't think of a great way to measure it, but I'm not sure that that's a horrible problem. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Josiah.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker now. Amanda Joyce is a cybersecurity analyst at Argonne National Labs, doing some really interesting work here with the DHS. One thing that's very interesting that she said in her background, visualizing interdependencies in critical infrastructure, which means that she is working on models that go well beyond my abilities. So I'd like to introduce her.
Thank you. You may see in your program it says Nathaniel Evans. He couldn't be here today, so I'm stepping in. First off, Argonne National Lab is located in about 20-30 minutes from Chicago, Illinois. We're FFRDC, which is a federally funded research and development center. So a lot of this paper actually came about a lot of our work that we do with DHS. Particularly, we've been working with DHS and the NCIC. For those of you that aren't familiar with the NCIC, it's the National Cyber and Communications Integration Center, which is kind of that main hub right now for cyber with the Department of Homeland Security. They were wanting us to look through some information for them, and we realized that the information sharing, as many people yesterday, including Sean Henry and Senator Warner, and many others today mentioned, is imperative for us to kind of move forward in understanding a one team, one fight kind of mission. Difficulty with that is a lot of things that we haven't mentioned yet is what information and what intelligence are you looking for? As someone had mentioned yesterday in the private sector, do you want my information? Okay, but tell me, what do you want? And I don't think many people have answered that question. So Argonne kind of proposed this international cyber incident repository system, which I don't want to say is an innovative approach, as we used, again, a lot of background from DHS, but something that hasn't really been tapped into lately. So I'm going to update in some of those numbers too, but based on current statistics for information sharing, the cost of a data breach in 2015 was around 3.79 million, 2016 and up to 4 million per data breach. For 2016, the cost of a record for a data breach was about $158. The biggest impact is the loss of business. So typically the data breach is, some of you may or may not go to Target anymore. Some of you may or may not go to Home Depot anymore. It's all a personal thing, but the biggest impact that most companies see is that their loss of business. These statistics for this, for 2015, was based on 350 companies in 11 countries. So it wasn't just the United States only. It was all around. 47% of those attacks were malicious actors. Again, that means there's still a majority of that. That doesn't mean they're malicious. It's accidents. It's an oops, I clicked that button. It's I deleted that. As well as insiders that may, again, be malicious, but not always technically considered an external malicious actor. So our current information sharing problems. So there's currently little information sharing at a broader level and even less on cyber incident sharing. Why do I say that? So there's international organizations set up to share information. Again, I'm not an expert in all of these, but obviously there's NATO, there's NORDEFCO, and there's the European Union. There's international organizations that are set up to collaborate with information. Difficulty with that is that we're not, again, providing those steps of what information we should even be collecting there. A lot of this is based on our current work with the fusion centers and the ISACs, which is the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers here in the United States. So as you can see, we have ISACs and ISOs. If you aren't familiar with those, there's multiple, and there's been a couple that have been mentioned. There's the Financial Services ISAC, there's Aviation ISAC, there's the Energy ISAC, Nuclear ISAC. It goes all over the place. The difficulty with ISACs, especially in the United States, is that you're sharing over here, I'm sharing my information over here, but there's never one that comes stacked together. And that area is supposed to be coming back through the NCIC and the US CERT of talking to all these, but not everyone plays ball. Other specific organizations is, again, countries like Australia, South Korea, Japan, Israel. They all have information sharing platforms in their countries, but again, there's no let's talk about what's going on in every country, put it together. So our proposed system, which I'm not even going to guess how they decided to pronounce it, but International Cyber Incident Repository System, the ICERS. Currently, there is an international forum out there for incident response called the FIRST. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but it is a fee-based membership. There's I don't have off the top of my head, but there's a a good amount of countries that are a part of it. The thought is that this first organization would work along with this international cyber incident repository system to kind of help manage and standardize what information they're looking for so that we can better equip the trending analysis throughout the entire world. So the ICIRS is a repository that would be utilized for all countries. Again, there's obviously always caveats with what information do I share, how much information do I want to share, should I be sharing this information? So the whole point of this international repository system is that it's on a voluntary basis. There's no regulatory information that requires you to input into it. Right now we propose that there is a governing body that is a neutral party to all. Examples of that would be something like NATO, the European Union. There's some sort of non-specific person that's doing that. As well as, since then you wonder, well, who gets access to this repository and what are they utilizing it for? So that gets again into that gray area of how much information do I divulge, knowing that I think China may have hacked me. Do I really want them to be able to see that I just inputted saying that I did have a cyber incident or they got something? We suggested a designated operator per country. That can be more than one person, but one unit is the sole person that gets access and is that initial person of validating a response as well as validating the incident coming in. So kind of the structure, as I mentioned, it's a voluntary nature. It means that a lot of in the United States, we have a lot of regulatory sectors. Energy is a big one, nuclear is a big one, financial sector has some of it. They're required to report, but this particular system, there'd be voluntary nature of all sorts. As I mentioned, the administration of the repository, again, we're not suggesting that any of these organizations actually do it, but there needs to be some sort of central organization that has no opinion or bias into the matter. So as I made an example, so the United States might have a designated operator, we'll say DHS. There's someone who is actually the owner and custodian of the US data, and they would be the central point of contact to that repository in order to get any information trending or whatnot. So we kind of utilized, then we think the legality of it all, like why would anyone come to the table to voluntarily give their information in the first place? So the Chemical Weapons Convention offers kind of that possible information sharing and protection model, as 19 countries have come together for this. 192 nations are state parties, which encompasses about 98% of the global population. They're able to come together and actually make an agreement on how to utilize chemical weapons throughout these. So there is a background of legality along with it that we've utilized. So to get to the benefits and the concerns, obviously the benefits are this allows, at least for the United States, I know it would be amazing for my own personal group here at Argonne, is the trending aspect. Again, we look at what the United States has seen or what's publicly available for other countries of what they see. There's things like information is beautiful that shows you distributed denial of service attacks in real time. But again, that's all inference data. So the ability to be able to trend and see, well, let's see over the year what has been interesting, what are the big hits, who are the typical targets and what are they targeting. That's a big area that you can see where companies, organizations, countries have that ability to move forward past that. Obviously, there's a gray area as well of potential threat actors. There would be no inference to countries, but if there are particular organizational groups, like Anonymous or whatnot, that have actually been attributed to it, you can kind of see what they're doing and what they're looking for. Potential vulnerabilities, so again, thinking in a simplistic approach of, everyone's got Adobe these days. We see that there's a new 0-day that hasn't been published by Adobe yet, but yet we've seen a slew of people hitting that particular vulnerability that kind of helps us to forecast out that potential vulnerability and how to patch it, as well as potential consequences, which I know is a big one for DHS, of what is the implications of it all. Is it just they tried to steal social security numbers? Was it credit cards? Was it information? What was the consequence of it? And what is that potential dollar amount out there that's going to have to fix that problem? And obviously the big one is the risks. Who actually guards and safekeeps this information? How are we ensuring that no random person out there can get into this information? Because in essence, it's sensitive data to each country that's inputting this. So the governing or administrative body of this would be the key point of contact of making sure that all of the safeguards are put in place for this. As we mentioned, credentials would only be issued to that designated body. So again, in my example would be DHS. And our assumption would be that there would only be a limited amount of credentials provided. And again, it's just as remove that credentials if that governing or that administrative body doesn't, or is no longer that key point in contact. As well as the administrative body is responsible for protecting that data. So if that data is utilized against, so the United States puts in a cyber incident today on yesterday's distributed denial of service. If tomorrow we find out that someone utilized that information to benefit themselves of either figuring out the flaw was or what particular information is using, it's up to that administrative body to ensure that the proper protocols are put in place to not have that happen. So as I mentioned, what data would you even be looking for in this incident repository system? So this is a quick overview of kind of a reporting template from us. As I mentioned, this came about from a project that we're working on right now with DHS and the NCIC. If you wouldn't only imagine, the US CERT and ICS CERT, and I apologize if any of you are in the room, they do not have the same set of reporting guidelines if there's a cyber incident in the United States. We've been privy to some of that information of what their reporting is, and the difficulty with that is that there's no way for me to correlate any trending even in the United States. Because what ICS CERT looks for, and that's the Industrial Control Systems Computer Emergency Response Team, is different than what the United States CERT is looking for. So we suggested you need to standardize this data. So what data are you looking for? So again, for an international one, you'd want to know what country is actually reporting. What's the targeted? Is it government? Is it private sector, public sector? Is it a specific company in general? And again, this all would ultimately be housed, but then can be anonymized very quickly or removed from public consumption. Timeline event, again, sometimes it's difficult to input, it's not required, but again, if you know that you actually were hit yesterday, but didn't find out until 3 days from now, it's kind of good to know that time frame of how long this event potentially occurred. The incident classification, again, currently we're using the US CERT categories, if you're familiar with those. Which are unauthorized access, denial of service, malicious code, improper usage, scanned probes, and then investigation, which is typically meaning that there's an unknown right now particularly how this occurred. And then if the attacker accessed data, what was taken, was it stolen, corrupted, falsified, was the integrity, was it availability, and then who or what was a suspected perpetrator. Between myself and one of the co-authors, I find this to be a little bit of a gray area, but if there's an assumption of if we know if there's a state actor, hacktivist, terrorist group, especially if it's a very directed attack. And then there would be a box finally for some open-ended comments. So if you know that the IP that hit it, if you know exactly how they got in, there would be an ability to actually input that data. With that, I will see if there's any questions or comments as long as they're not difficult. There's one up here.
How much technical data would you want in that database? Would you want like full packet capture or just what IP address the attack is coming from, or how technical do you want to get, or is it just whatever the supplying party is willing to give up?
So that's a good question, because I think that's part of where our work with the fusion centers and ISACs in the US have an issue is there's not an issue of like how much data is being put in there. Sometimes you give too much data and it just becomes data overload. So I think how in our brains have envisioned is that technical aspect of IP addresses or files or whatnot that's been attacked should come to either the ISAC of the country, and then that international one would be that one step above with less technical. And then again, if there's a question of, I think that these two might be linked somehow, that those two parties could have a conversation. I think the more technical that we get into there is further down the road, because I think, again, when you start adding IP addresses, there starts to become inferences on who did what or how it was done, and the whole point of the repository is that we're not pointing fingers at people. Here's one here in the front.
How would you protect private industry from corporate competition, assuming there would be leaks, there would be, and liability issues, which is the whole problem with data collection generally, especially in the US?
So that's a good question. The liability of it would, again, and I just made that assumption of, like, for example, DHS being the United States point of contact. There is always that issue of, like, what if I don't trust DHS with my data, which happens quite a lot. That there's that ability to, and again, there's all that gray area of circumventing that issue. We do have in the full-blown paper of if you have a personal conflict or that governing or administrative body, so again in my example DHS, you don't get along with, or they don't feel that your incident is worthy enough, or that they don't want anyone to know about it, but yet you're trying to, comply with things. There's a circumvention way of going right to that administrative body and having it happen. In regards to ensuring safeguarding measures of the data, again, that kind of lies on whomever is the owner, quote unquote, of that repository system. Obviously, there would have to be a full-blown list of rules and configuration, and everyone who's coming to the table and agreeing to report these incidents would have to agree to it. So everyone might not say, again, we talked about the cloud this morning. Not everyone thinks that the cloud is the most secure environment. And again, where does this data sit? Is it sitting in a country that's agreeing to this? Is it sitting in the US? Who owns it? Is there protection rights and whatnot? So that would come in what I would assume, based off our writing, is a kind of a governing doctrine that everyone's agreeing to. And then I would assume there's no penalties to it, but at least that what we've put through. But there'd be some sort of ramifications for people who utilize the data in an incorrect way.
Yes, no formal penalties, but
yeah,
they could be penalized.
Penalized in some way.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Matthew Hunter from the Cyber COE. Who would the information be available to once it's in the repository? Just government agencies, private industry, be able to use the information to protect, defend, and to set up their networks afterwards.
So right now, how we have it, again, outlined in the paper is that that designated body would be that point of contact, but there would be some sort of reporting measure. So if, again, you're familiar with fusion centers, DHS, and how the government all works, you get 1,000,001 email blasts saying that this is what's going on, this is happening, here's the vulnerability, here's the threat going on. Is that particular designated body from each country would be the only contact into the repository. It kind of limits the number of hands in the cookie pot of changing, altering, or whatnot. But there's an ability to get a reporting kind of thing where you could see the trending of just basic information that's put in there. So I don't know if that really answers your question fully, but our idea of it is that there's less people having that ability to edit, comment, or change information in there. It's more of a data pull and a basic information. All right, thank you.
Again, thank you so much, Amanda. I'd like to talk to you definitely more about this offline on some of the technical aspects as well. This seems really interesting. I'd like to now introduce our anchor for this session. Jose de Morales is an up-and-coming MA candidate at University of Texas at San Antonio. He's awarded an NSF Scholarship for Service, and he's done some research on the extraction of attack signatures from large data sets.
Hello, my name is Josiah Dykstra. I go by Joe. I'm a master's student candidate in computer science, University of Texas. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to present. This is my first presentation, so be kind. So my research focus is in network traffic data analytics, specifically finding methodologies that aid in assigning attribution to cyber attacks. So what got me started in this is that I actively compete in cyber competitions, specifically the National Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. We're done for you. And my role is typically in the network administration. And it's a very daunting task. You're inundated with terabytes of data, and how do you make sense of this offline? So the opportunity came to me to be able to actually audit the PCAP files for the same very competition that I participated with. And I thought that was a great way, and just go ahead and dive in and get into it. And then I realized how large the data set was, and trying to make sense of that was very difficult. So naturally, I just wanted to figure out, okay, well, how do we even get started? How do we work with this? And what we end up finding is that when it comes to challenges and innovation and understanding cyberspace, the sheer size of our data set seems to be one of the largest obstacles that we have. So the analysis is complex, it's time consuming, but it's also time consuming to actually process the data sets as well. So attribution and finding actionable meaning in data sets in the context of network capture traffic is a very difficult thing. So how do we make the data make sense to operators, to analysts, to researchers? How do we enable them to see the forest and not get stuck in the trees? So our approach is the notion of attack narratives. So what exactly is an attack narrative? An attack narrative is, in simplest terms, the connecting the dots of the signatures that you find in the network traffic. So every single signature is a dot, and we want to try to map them in a way that's meaningful and gives us the story that helps us formulate what happens. But this requires a model. There are several models to choose from, and we decided that we were going to conduct our case study with the 2015 National Cyber Collegiate Defense Competition by mapping those signatures against the Mandeep lifecycle, hoping that maybe something interesting would pop out of the data set. And it did. So the methodology that we came up with, and this is a really stripped down version of some packet headers that we pulled off just to give it some context. But in our above example, the attack signature is actually the portion that we would be able to see that this is an SSH port suite. You know, we're looking at this port and we're going down a logical manner. Easy. Very classic, very simple signature. And then something, for example, like obvious web traversal attack, trying to look for the SE password file or command exe. Those are your signatures. Excuse me. Those are the signatures. Whether you collect them by whatever methodology you have, proprietary or open source, if you use Snort, whatever you can find your signatures, they're there. They're the classic ones. But what we're proposing is, okay, well, let's tie those to nodes. Let's make something meaningful with them. So in our case, we categorize them as general port suite, or this is a directory traversal. We created the nodes. And then what the magic comes into actually mapping those nodes against the Mandeep framework. So for example, one step in the framework would be the initial recon and then the initial compromise signatures. So we try to map it to that life cycle to see what pops out. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Mandeep attack lifecycle specifically and what features that we're using in the lifecycle to try to assign something interesting and make sense of all this. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with Mandeep's attack lifecycle, these are the steps: initial recon, compromise, establish foothold, escalating privileges, internal recon. We can move laterally, maintain persistence. We can go in the cycle over and over again, move around, complete the mission, and that's it. Specifically, what we're looking at are, since it's, I wouldn't necessarily call it a toy problem, but it's a case study. So we reduce the scope of everything down to 4 key elements, which is the initial recon, the compromise, the foothold, and the maintain presence. So we only focus on those 4 to see what was quick and we could pull out. So when it comes to the initial recon step, this is the phase of the attack that we would consider, for example, like port scanning, port sweeps. Once those are finished in our data set, we would expect that the attacker would begin the assault of the services that he discovered, which leads to the initial compromise. We expect to see patterns here that relate to forced password attempts, SMB attacks, NetBIOS attacks, directory traversal, which is you saw an example of, and other such attacks trying to get into the system. We talked about the Etsy password brute forcing. So in the established foothold phase, this is about creating the presence in the compromised system so that the attacker can conduct their objective. Therefore, attack signatures in this phase will consist of techniques such as creating backdoors, installing rootkits, stuff that we can see in clear traffic. We didn't focus on SSH stuff because it's encrypted, obviously. So, but the key here is, okay, so we start taking these signatures. We know that we've seen them in various devices, intrusion prevention systems, protection systems. So let's start assigning them places in this model to see what pops up. So let's put it together. Let's actually go through this. So we take the previous slide that you saw, we categorize them, same thing here in directory traversal, and we start to try to map it to the life cycle. So here at the bottom are the actual stages of the life cycle that we were referring to. So for example, this is a hypothetical attack. This is something that we did to model, to show what it would look like in theory. So here we can think of this as a rudimentary attacker fingerprint. The caveat to this is the persistent use of attackers' methodologies and tools. So our future work includes trying to mitigate this caveat. So the attacker decides they want to change it up a bit. What does it really look like? So in this narrative, I'll start from left to right. What we have here is an attacker that likes to hide under the cover of other port scans and then uses SYN scanning to discover some vulnerabilities. Once they've discovered their vulnerabilities, then they've enumerated that they can get in with MSO 867, directory traversal, they may have found some credential, they may have been able to get to the password file here and extract it. Maybe, perhaps in this example, somebody used OS Commerce and didn't change the admin password, something simple, right? So this isn't a very sophisticated attacker. This is somebody who just got lucky or found some interesting things and note the use of MSO 867. I actually still see this. It's a really great attack. It just keeps paying off. I love it. And then from here, we have is we actually can see that, okay, in the foothold signatures, we start seeing signatures in network traffic that are for remote access Trojans. We may have seen an account being created in the clear, so that leads from this. And so what we're trying to find are the nodes that connect it, so these along these edges here. And then at this point, we may get nothing further that pops up. But yet, in the remote access Trojan, we may see some lateral movement with some internal SYN scans that go back to pivot. They use their stuff all over again. Eventually, they'll set up some very simple netcat backdoors to try to move in and out. So ideally, if an attacker, what you can pull from something like this is a skill set, potentially the tools that they're using, which help give a little bit further identity to the attacker. If you put a little bit more work into the remote access Trojan, trying to identify it, what the wrapper is, and whatnot, you get a little bit more information. But the idea is you put this all together in very discrete units that help break the story out. So instead of having a huge stack of needles, you start categorizing them and moving them around and seeing what pops out from the data. So let's look at a rule attack narrative. This is one that we found against a particular team in the 2015 data set. We've anonymized it, maybe ECF, I don't know. So this is a particularly interesting one for me. This was a massive amount of port scanning. They didn't care at all. They were just loud and proud about it. And I was trying to wonder why do this? Why be so loud? What's the point? And it turns out that this was to hide smaller scans, very simple, refined scans, low bandwidth. And then what was really neat about this is that they fed one scan into potentially another one once they've enumerated the machines, what ports are available. So this indicates that this is automated. And we're looking at the timestamps, obviously. But the back and forth between just the reconnaissance efforts and suggest either a heavy dependence on automation or a lot of thought put into it, or a lot of different attackers. We don't know that just from this. But this in itself is a methodology. It is a signature. So okay, let's go ahead and expand upon that. What happens next? So. So from those vulnerabilities that we actually did see attempts at NSO 867, directory traversal. This sticks out like a sore thumb. I mean, this is big. You just see it everywhere. And then R login. So they attempted R login, and actually it worked. So I was actually kind of impressed with that. So we can see how they got in, or how, excuse me, more specifically, how they attempts, or what they were doing to try to hit. And like I said, the edges along the nodes are where we could follow the narrative along and know, yes, this was the result of that. The remote access Trojan that was installed on here, we're not sure where it came from, and obviously we can't connect as edge, so that shows that there is a break in our model. And this is something that lets us know, okay, we should go back and take a look at this. Maybe there's something here that we're missing, or maybe we can further enumerate this. And then finally, with the maintain persistence web shells in one particular team, we saw that they just dropped some PHP web shells in the web servers. And again, we can't establish how, but we know that where our breaks are and where we can go to do more focus and some more research. Okay, so how do we see the forest and not just the trees? Well, if you're given a bunch of trees, organize the trees. Go make yourself a little forest. And that's kind of the overwhelming thing. Is that so we decided to use a particular framework that helped us build little forests, and that's essentially what we've done here. We've created a little fingerprint or a little mini map of the attacker, their thought process, their methodology, where they went through. These make a lot better sense than the individual signatures themselves when you try to put them together. And what we can do with some deep data analytics is really features that are unique to them. And so what do I mean by deep data analytics? Well, if we look at the metadata behind it, and this is something that we proposed. So the idea of measuring entropy or randomness in attacks that use encryption, it's a well-papered idea. There's a lot of stuff out there for it. So we start asking questions, and I'm not a cryptographer, so I can't answer this for you. But it's like, okay, do those values of randomness actually have any real meaning? Is there something to that? So those are the kind of deep data analytics that you can do inside that. And also perhaps measure a mean route through this. So one example, this is graph. So there might be a more advantageous or a more optimal way to transverse through a network as an attacker. Does it mean something if the attacker deviates from what we consider a mean? Does that indicate sophistication? I don't know. That's what some of our future research is going to focus on. But that's what we're talking about when we mean deep data analytics. And that's how attack narratives help us reduce that focus and isolate those features. But there are limitations. Obviously, this is initially very heavily dependent on manual labor. Poor grad students like myself, it's peering over PCAP files and T-sharp dumps over and over and over again. But it does show potential in identifying, at least cataloging attackers, because amongst the data set that we use, which was the CCDC traffic, there are some distinct differences, even though we're told that the attackers in this data set try to even the attack surface out, and team 1, team 2, team 3 will all get the same attack. That's not what the data shows. So that kind of lets us know that, okay, so there's a little flair from the attackers. They're doing some different things, even though they're all told to do some standardization. One of the really great things about this data set is that we have a pretty good relationship with the people that are hosting it. And then when we're done with our work, in a very brave attempt, I will show them and ask them to verify the accuracy of our stuff. So we're scared and excited about that, to be able to come back and maybe possibly publish some accuracy results. The big one is, what standard do we use? So whose standard and attack signatures do we go by? You know, the attack signatures are, can be proprietary. They can be open source. North, for example, has, last time I checked, over 30,000 attack signatures that you could use. Do you want to use those strings? Do you want to use CVEs? What do you want to use? So that's something that we're trying to standardize in our own work. And then there's the issue of dynamic versus static detection. Obviously, all this stuff was done offline. We looked at it. We had time. You know, we didn't have the worry of an attack that's happening right now. We haven't thoroughly moved this into a dynamic setting for live analysis. So that's something that we definitely want to look into further down the line. So some of our ongoing research is definitely to define this model. We want to throw a little math at it. So it is potentially, you have the capability for graph theory, so we really want to try refining that mathematically and see what that looks like. We want to build automation tools to get all away from the manual labor, try some machine learning techniques, see what we can do, maybe with some neural nets. Outside the scope of what I do, but some of the people that I work with, that's something they're really excited about. When we fully flesh this out, we might be able to test the effectiveness of commercial products. So if we're able to map out, or open source products, if we're able to map out our attack narrative, well, what happens when we throw other systems at it? Will they spit out similar results? And if we have ground truth, then we can actually test the effectiveness of other products. And then, ultimately, we are definitely trying to quantify and measure our accuracy and maybe come up with some standards for that. Okay, so how about some related work? All right, so why did we choose Mandeep's attack lifecycle versus Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain? Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain is great. We argue that the kill chain is more from an attacker's perspective. It's a reverse engineering of the attacker's methodology, whereas the life cycle is what the defender kind of sees within their systems and the maneuverability. So we feel that the Mandeep type life cycle is a better model for that. It's better fit. So then there's alert correlation. So what's the difference between our attack narrative versus alert correlation? Alert correlation is driven more so on an event. So if you have your logs, your alert logs, and you're trying to categorize them in a way to help give you a little bit more insight on the scenario or what's happening, versus the narrative is more aimed towards identifying the attacker by trying to give something unique to pop out of that. There, you can probably take some of those alerts and apply them to the life cycle, but our research is almost entirely based on that work that we captured that. And then there's the diamond model for intrusion analysis. The diamond model is an excellent model for analysts. It's critically complicated and has a lot of features that can prove useful. But we feel that this is an analytical tool. It introduces I don't want to call it human. It introduces human biases into it through each individual analyst's interpretation of what's going on. What we're trying to do is come up with a standardization, which is one of the problems that we're trying to solve. To be able to not rely on individual analysts or researchers' ideas of what makes an attack signature or an attack. So what's the takeaway message? It's definitely possible to make large amounts of data make sense to people. It's just a matter of how you organize it and break it up, just like a lot of other frameworks. Ours specifically, we're really trying to find the individual signature, what makes it unique and different amongst people, and we feel that the Mandeep lifecycle and possibly some variants of it will expand those features for us. As you can see, we can definitely find the attack gaps and the gaps in our narrative and see where we need to focus, potentially maybe even predict attack flows and where they might move next if this was a dynamic analysis. And ultimately, we're able to attempt to try to understand the tactics that are used in this and try to enumerate. So if you see this type of scanning, again, the very sophisticated scanning that was there, is that a unique signature? Will we see that again later down the line? And if we do see that later down the line, is that a hit? Is that a match? And definitely, how far can we go with this? We keep spinning off new problems, new ideas. There's more things that pop out of this, and as ideas come, papers start coming, and my advisor says you should write more papers. I'm a trained graduate, so no more papers. But yeah, so that's it. If you have any, definitely we're going to take questions. But if you are offline and you're saying, "Oh, Joe, there's something wrong with this," or "You didn't think of this," or "Hey, you're wrong about something," I really want to know that. I'm really passionate about this work. I find it very interesting and exciting. So, I thought there was one of this here. But yeah, in the paper, and that you will have copies of, my email address is in there, and I would really welcome any comments or any criticisms, no matter what they are. Ultimately, we can only get better through the gauntlet that is peer review, right? So I welcome anything that you have. And now I'll take any questions. Great, no questions.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Jose for an interesting talk. We have 12 minutes left, which is actually enough time to let each of the panelists ask each other some questions or take some extra questions from the audience. Before that happens, I just would like to point out that there was a natural flow between these talks. We started with training and education, focusing essentially on workforce development, then transitioning into a workflow within the workforce, then moving on to what data are we sharing from this workflow, and finally attempts at mining this data that we share. And I look forward to hearing any comments you have. And I do want to initially rebut one comment that Amanda made, that her research wasn't necessarily novel. And I just want to point out that one of the hallmark of great ideas is that they look common sense after the fact, and to not discount the work that she's been doing. Anyway, so I'd also like to open the floor up again for more questions and to let our panelists ask each other questions.
So Jose, I have a question.
Yes.
What considerations would have to be made to do what you're describing in real time as opposed to in hindsight or after the fact?
Definitely the storage of that data is one of the big problems that we've seen in other research papers. How quickly that turns over, because the ability to, the data size, especially in PCAPs, grows very quickly over time. And it's not uncommon to have a few terabytes after a day or so. And it also depends on the size of the enterprise that you're looking at. Small mom-and-pop operations aren't going to have anywhere near that, but large, I mean, this was just a small competition that had a simulated enterprise network, and it generated, a few terabytes worth of data. So that's probably one of the bigger ones to make it in real time, is how do we process the storage of that, and how do we move that in and out of systems to analyze it. That would be the one that I think would be the biggest challenge so far.
Question to Bruce, with your work with simulations and training, and you can't put everything in the certificate program you're trying to build, but are you also looking at trying to build some of your simulation or training basis for, say within the military, the staffs that are very addicted to a constant information flow that then get interrupted in a contested cyber environment, and trying to teach them how to cope with that?
It's like I planned that question. In a way, we have, out of the 5 classes that we have a cyber operations lab. So that's really the hands-on component to the certificate program. The future work of it, and with the hacker club that's in the computer science department, which is another department from where I work, where they house the hacker club that keeps winning. Our plan is to create 2 cyber operations labs. One would be a teaming lab that we would run that would look at the dynamics between the operators, the analysts, and everybody that's on a team, and how to make it more efficient and effective over the long haul. And they would be part of that. The adjunct to that, this would be a multi-purpose lab, because not just for the training for the certificate, it's also to do research to get at some of the things you just said. So, how do you do it better, how do you do it more efficient? Because, there's PEO strides there, all the simulation on the acquisition side for all the services are in Orlando, with a construct called Team Orlando, and they're very interested in it. They haven't been historically, but every time we have a meeting, they ask, what are you doing in cyber? Both from the behavioral side, the human element, human in loop, that we deal with, along with the computer, more than just computer science, computer engineers are really getting into it too, side of it as well. So the 2 labs, the one that we have and the one that this planet that we will have, and the one that the computer science department will have, we're hopefully going to connect them together so that they can actually be the red team for some of our research and development as well. So to answer your question, no, we're not there yet. Very new program, but hopefully by this time next year, I can have a better update.
Yeah, the question for Josiah. I don't know if you're aware of the Dartmouth Cyber Grand Challenge that took place for autonomous systems that were actively doing protection.
Yep.
And the methods that they were going about in their autonomy and protecting their systems from intrusion, and how the Kinevin approaches that you described may have been applied to any of those autonomous systems. But if you have insight into that, I'd like to know.
I don't, but that's a great question. Because, like you said, it was designed so that the computers were doing the analysis and sort of making automated decisions. I don't know, as a computer scientist, I think most engineers would also take these sort of act as quickly as possible sort of approach as opposed to like coming up with an algorithm that said, well, I guess machine learning people do this, but explore lots of opportunities, right? Look at lots of things and sort of pick the best one. I guess the more I think about it, the more that is kind of a machine learning approach. I would have a hard time like mapping the Grand Challenge programs into that framework, but that's a great thing to think about. I actually have a related question for you on international data sharing, which was about that speed. One thing I worry about a lot is paper-based reporting. Because the response is so time dependent, right? I really want to take action as quickly as possible, and I want ways to automate. I always look for ways to automate. How do you think that reconciles with this, what sounds like a rather manual process?
Good question. So actually my colleague and I were just talking about this right before lunch. He said, a lot of things people are bringing up is, I want to automate. I don't want to have a man in the middle kind of thing. And I think automation can occur. We need to figure out the standard, what information is needed, and know that you actually have the ability to report on that automatically. I agree with you that time sensitiveness is of the essence. The difficulty with that is you'll find a lot of companies that don't realize that they've been attacked for months, years, or they keep it quiet for months because they're trying to figure out even how that someone got into the system. But we did think about automation. The difficulty with that when in the forefront is that would mean that everyone would have to have every single data point available in order to be able to automate it. But I think further down the road that automation, for the time consumption of it, is definitely a feasible option.
A question for Amanda. I've looked at the various certs that they have in Russia and know how difficult it is to get anyone to voluntarily report, especially to voluntarily report to international bodies, and certainly Russian InfoSec specialists rely on the US cert and CVE system and things. And so that's probably sort of the closest we have to an international clearinghouse. And so it sounds as if the closest you have to what you're describing is the existing FIRST, and you talked about how that was fee-based. Are you saying that's the main difference? That is the fee-based is a disincentive for potential partners to contribute to this or to be part of it? And if so, could you build on somehow tweaking FIRST to make it work better? And is there anything you can learn from the experience of getting people to voluntarily join and contribute with FIRST?
Sure. So I guess I never really thought of the way that you had phrased that question. So I guess we never initially thought of a fee-based membership. We kind of thought it would be a conjoined thing that FIRST could work along with that reported incident. But I do agree with you that I think a fee-based membership into something like this actually does kind of reduce some of that risk of someone just being able to have access to data all the time. Though I don't think, again, necessarily having a fee would completely eliminate that risk of having people do that. In order to bring people to the table, again, unfortunately, in the society we live in, there has to be some sort of like, what do I get in return for giving you my data? And I think that still remains to be unknown of how much each individual player would get back. I think, in my personal opinion on it, I think the value that you bring to the table is just equivalent to the value you'll get out. So if you're not willing to report or provide enough information, you're not going to glean the information that you want back. And I think the more success of, again, a lot of this is based on the current CERT and ISAC successes, but also failures in the US, is that I think the more that it comes out that these cyber incidents are correlated in some fashion, the more that people will be willing to actually provide that information as quickly as possible versus out in the time frame that they want to give.
I'd like to thank all of the all of our panelists and speakers today. We have about 2 minutes left, and I don't know if I want to stand between academics and military and their coffee. So I would just like to have a round of applause for everyone for all the hard work that they've done. These were some great topics, great questions, great responses. And please seek them out during the coffee break for any additional questions you may have.